And here we go. We have a couple of people starting to arrive in now. Hello, welcome along. Just give everyone a second to make sure everybody's connected. We're going out live to social media. Yes, we are. Fantastic. Alrighty. Well, let's kick off then. And before we begin, of course, as always, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting here this evening. Tonight, myself and our special guest, Karen Mundine, are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and Jane, as always, is on the lands of the Camaragal people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend a particularly warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here this evening, our guests in the chat. And I would also invite everyone in the chat as well to share the lands that you're on if you like, because it's important to acknowledge that wherever we're zooming in from across Australia this evening, we are all on First Nations land and sovereignty was never ceded. So, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Reasonings with Jane. I'm Hannah Ma. I'm the number 2 candidate for the Senate in New South Wales for Reason Australia, and I'll be looking after the Q&A tonight once again. And as always, our host is Reason Australia's lead candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, the frank and fearless Jane Caro. Welcome, Jane.
Okay, that's good. I like that very much. Magnetic had me worried, but frank and fearless is good.
I have to think of a very special one for our last one before the
That's
election.
Right. Yes. Maybe you could do a reverse cell. No, don't. Sorry, I take that back.
And joining Jane tonight is a very special guest, Karen Mundine. Karen is a proud Bundjalung woman of the Northern Rivers region, but grew up in Western Sydney, I believe. She's the CEO of Reconciliation Australia and has been at the forefront of First Nations leadership and empowerment for over 20 years, and has been instrumental in some watershed national events, including events leading up to and including the Centenary of Federation, the 2007 Apology to the Stolen Generations, and many more. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, and Jinguala, everybody. So great to be here.
It's lovely to have you, Karen. And I would also just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Hannah said, I'm on Camaragal land, but this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And that's pretty much what we're talking about tonight, actually, is this ancient country and this incredibly long-lasting 60,000-year-old civilization and peoples. And I think there's been such a long road for First Nations people. I'm not talking about the whole 60,000 years. I'm talking about the last, 250, which has possibly seemed like the longest and hardest road of all. And I think one of the things that really stands out for me is how much patience, generosity of spirit, humour and goodwill Aboriginal Australians have shown over those years, in stark contrast, I would have to say sometimes, to those who came and colonised the country, including, of course, myself. So how? I mean, I'm really interested in that. How, why the patience? How have you managed to maintain your sense of really the family of humanity and keep your eyes on the prize for so long without losing heart?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that when it comes to patience, if you had asked my grandmother and my mother, who are no longer with us, but if they were here, they would definitely be shaking their head and saying, Karen does not have any patience whatsoever. So that's the first one out there. The second thing I would say is that it's worth remembering that not all of our people have kept hope, that some of them have lost hope over the last 200 plus years. And we see that playing out time and time again in terms of the relationship between First Nations peoples and the broader Australian community, and particularly the nation state, if you like. But I guess for the rest of us that hang in there, that continue to do the work that I do and many, many others, sure, you might be talking about the last 200 years, but I think so many of us take strength of the tens of thousands of years that came before that. We look at our ancestors, we look at the generations before us and what they stood for. And I think it's really important to remember is that we have nowhere else to go. This is our home. This country is our place. It's our land, but it's our identity. It's our mob and it's who we are. We can't at some point go, it's not working, I'm going back to the homeland. This is our homeland. And so in some respects, because it's so intrinsically connected to who we are and our identity, you have to keep going. You have to keep fighting. It's that thing of the alternatives are giving up hope and laying down and not being part. So yes, it is at times hard, absolutely. But as you said, I've met the funniest people. Sometimes they're these aunties and uncles with really dry sense of humour, making really what I would call smart-ass comments, looking at the world, just humour. And again, I look at and think about cultures and communities from right across the world. It always seems to be that humour that keeps you going. It's the strength of your ancestors. It is that connection to country. It's our identity. So when you can draw from that, that gives you every reason to keep going. And then I look at my nieces and my nephews and I think about those next generations and what can I do now that makes it better or easier for them.
Yeah, I love when you talk about the dry sense of humour, because I have a theory for what it's worth. I have no data, no evidence to really back it up or surveys or studies, but a million observation that I think the Australian sense of humour is actually the Aboriginal sense of humour, that in fact that we've borrowed that from you. You've created that in our culture, because every time I hear First Nations people, talking together, or I read one of Melissa Lukashenko's great books, it just hits me in the face that it's that dry Aussie laid back, and it's so much part of Aboriginal culture. And it strikes me that that's a huge strength, that because I find the best humour always has a strain of real down-to-earth wisdom in it.
Absolutely.
It's the shock of recognition of truth that often makes us laugh. So it's something I've admired for a really long time. I'm probably stolen myself on occasions.
I think humour is something that we can all share, though.
Yeah, I hope so. Yes. Well, some people seem to lack it, I have to observe. I won't mention any names, but in this section there might be a couple that I think have a rather obvious lack of it, but let's not go there for this conversation. What I want to ask you, and this is purely from you as an individual, your perspective, what does your vision of reconciliation look like? So casting forward with your nieces and nephews and things, where would you like it to end up? What would that look like?
Yeah, for me, I mean, as an individual, my idea of the future and what does reconciliation look like, and I think it's important to say that reconciliation is the journey, not the destination, but casting forward, what does it look like? It is a place in Australia that values my nieces and nephews and their cultural heritage and everything that means and everything that brings into who they are as upstanding citizens, as people who contribute to the broader community, but there's a real connection and recognition of them as First Peoples and what that additionally means. And that's really shared and celebrated by the broader Australian community. So by that, they can be they could be heads of corporations, they can have very urban, industrialized lives, but they can also be connected to their place and to their country, our country. And by that, I mean our homeland. And that as an Australian society in every facet, so not just in our sporting, it's not just in kind of acknowledgements or welcomes to country, but in the way we think about government and business and policy making, the things that are uniquely First Nations and the things that actually just make us look at things through a different lens are incorporated to give us this truly Australian way of being and knowing and doing. And I think that for me is what reconciliation is about. When we embrace First Nations people, all of it, into who we are as a modern nation.
And that's what's so interesting about the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and also the part of that is about having a First Nations voice to Parliament, because that is a way that you can actually do exactly what you were just talking about. Always make sure that First Nations lens is cast over everything that is decided at the very, at where those decisions are made. And that strikes me as, well, I think an obvious thing to do, actually, and I think it would benefit us all. It would enrich our policy making and our way of seeing ourselves as a country. And the thing that struck me when I read the Statement from the Heart, and I read it again today, obviously, to prepare, is how beautifully written it is. Because, I'm a writer, and it just moved me so much, because the use of language and the sense of this being a kind of founding document, that really came strongly across to me, that it read a little bit like the, American Constitution, the founding fathers. It had that sense of a foundational document. And Australia doesn't really have anything like that.
No, look, I'm a fan of history, a nerd, some would even say, and I worked on the Centenary of Federation, and I learned a lot about our Constitution at that time, but it's a pretty dry document, I have to say. There isn't anything that is inspirational. It's no, Gettysburg Address, or it's nothing that kind of makes you swell with pride. And I think that's one of the most beautiful pieces of writing, as you said, that Uluru Statement. It tells a story. And, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations peoples, we are storytellers, if nothing else. We need to understand where we've come from, because that so much informs where we are today, but also it helps us and gives us tools to think about where do we want to go tomorrow. So what are the pitfalls that we've learned from the past? What have we learned and what's new in terms of where we are today? But then how do we meld that and take that into creating something that's even better going forward? And I think, again, that invitation to be part of this journey, you speak about generosity. Again, it's like, this isn't just our history here, particularly when we talk about the last 200 years. That's not just First Nations people's history. That's non-Indigenous people's history as well. You're part of that story. And so we need to figure out a way of how do we weave all of these threads together to create this new tapestry of who we want to be in the future.
Maybe until we do that, we don't really know what it is to be an Australian, that in a way we're sort of half formed. We're not actually fully ourselves. And maybe that's why we struggle sometimes with things like generosity of spirit and, feeling confident about our own place in the world, because we haven't actually done the work we need to do to reconcile with ourselves, and therefore become wholly ourselves and live up to our potential. That at the moment, I don't think we're actually, I think we might have been going a bit backwards on that for a while, but that's my own bias.
Well, I think we're still in progress, and I think that's okay as well. Again, reconciliation is the journey, and so this is us kind of working through, and like an awkward, gangly teenager, sometimes we get it right and we're brilliant, and sometimes we're moody, and sometimes we're sullen, and sometimes we absolutely get it wrong. So I think, it's a work in progress. But having said that, I think until First Nations people, who we are, our history, and also that way of thinking and being is embraced, we will never be uniquely Australian. We'll be a copycat of Britain or Europe or America. The thing that is unique and doesn't exist anywhere else in the world is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the First Nations people of this country. And so until the broader community, until the broader kind of nation state figures out how that's woven in a positive and affirming way, we're just going to constantly struggle against that.
And given the really quite awful, devastating and violent history of the colonisation of this country, do you think that before we can get to that point where it's woven in and we have kind of become more whole, do you think we need something like a truth-telling commission as they had in South Africa at the end of apartheid?
So, yeah, there are truth-telling processes right across the country, and certainly a formalised commission is part of that. And we're seeing at the moment what's happening in Victoria with the Uluru Justice Commission, really powerful formalised process, Indigenous-led. So absolutely, truth-telling has to be part of reconciling, and it has to be about grappling with where to next. Because as I said, you've got to understand where you've come from, what's happened in the past, to figure out where we are today, but also to map that way forward. Truth-telling is so powerful. And I mean, South Africa is one thing to look at. I think probably the Canadian experience is probably a more comparable, both in terms of society, in terms of our history and what we're talking about. South Africa was very much around that restorative justice, and so it was dealing with not only historical things, but things that were very recent. And so there was a kind of a need to do that quickly and fast. But I've looked at truth-telling processes right across the country and spoken to many different people. And I think one of the things that came through time and time again, it's about there's not just one way to do this, not only for a country, but also there are formalised processes which are important, particularly when they're connected to justice or legal kind of processes that sit under that. But there are also ways that communities can start having these truth-telling sessions or having these conversations, talking about local parks, talking about why that river is called, the particular name that it's called. And there are some very still unsavory names out there around the country. Just even talking about why the Aboriginal community lives in which part of town and why that is, starts to unpack it. I mean, I think we have to grapple with our past, the good, the bad, and the quite often ugly. But I think we also need to remember there are also good stories that are part of that as well. So it's not always doom and gloom. And I think that's maybe sometimes the thing that stops us or scares us in starting those conversations. But we can't be Pollyanna about it. It was a bloody history. And until we unpack that, until we figure out how we move through it, we can't heal. Certainly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can't heal. And we saw that with the stolen generations and just how important it was to have that formal apology. So you could also say that the Royal Commission that happened was a kind of truth-telling process.
Yeah.
But then having that formalised apology from the Prime Minister at such a national scale, to having worked with them, having their story believed was so important to them, coming through. So not just saying, yes, this thing happened, and there were so many Australians who were saying, no, that didn't happen, but then to say, oh, we'll just get over it. And we've seen time and time again how we actually need to tell those stories. We need to, even though it can be painful, the positive thing that comes out of it, the healing part of it that comes out of it at the other end is what we're aiming for.
It sounds very like how we, are learning very slowly to treat trauma and to honour it, and to understand that you can't just pretend it never happened, that actually trauma has to be faced up to, it has to be acknowledged, it has to be in a way honoured. And, we see this with women perhaps coming out of abusive relationships. We're much better at dealing with trauma perhaps in returned soldiers than once upon a time we were, but we're still only taking baby steps with women from violent relationships, and also I think with First Nations people who are really suffering often from generational trauma, but not just that, because we still have the most horrendous statistics on Black deaths in custody, and no justice, nobody has been held to account for that. And isn't it up? I'm going to get the figure wrong, but it's 400 and something deaths, I think, nearly 500 deaths. That we have to face.
Yeah, look, and it's all of these things, as you say, it is about trauma. It's that intergenerational trauma that builds on top of it. And again, it's not just historical, because with each of those generations, you get new traumas that add to that. And that's the kind of weight. And as I said at the beginning, these are some of our people who have lost hope, who don't see a place in our society for them. And that's continues to impact them and across the community. So, and I think that's what it's important when we think about history. We can't just think about it as, well, that happened back then, that wasn't me. Just get over it and we'll be okay. It's actually, we continue to bear that grief, that hurt, that trauma in every generation that comes through. I think of my family, and when I think of stolen generations, so none of my immediate family were stolen generations, but they still lived with the trauma of that threat. They still told stories of having to run and hide in the bush, and as the older kids had to scoop up the younger kids and look after them until it was okay to come back out again. And then that played out in weird ways when I was growing up. And if I was late coming home from school, or I'd stopped off at a friend's place, I would get hell to pay for, where were you? What was happening? And I never fully understood as a kid why that was, until later in life I understood that history and that trauma that was being carried through. So we absolutely need to, as you say, we're still working out how we do that on an interpersonal relationship, how we extrapolate that at a national and nationwide and community level is something to still be worked through. But again, I get to see some really great, hopeful moments where this is happening, where communities are coming together to face that pain collectively, who are looking at ways of how do we do this differently, because we don't want to keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And, there is this kind of growing allyship of people out there in all sorts of different roles and places. When we think about how many more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander politicians we have, both at federal and state and local government levels, when we see the growing number of institutions, so organisations, corporates, businesses, schools, who are kind of considering how and what their role is in all of this and how they're doing it differently. That's what gives me hope that we're actually chipping away at this stuff.
Well, talking about hope, and given that we're about a week and a half away from an election, and given that I'm standing for the Senate, and so is Hannah, who introduced us, what would you like to see this election talking about that they're not talking about? And I do think First Nations people have been a bit conspicuous in their absence from the basically, discussions that we're hearing. What would you like to hear, and what would you like to see? What would you like from someone like me, for example, if I was lucky enough to get into the Senate?
I think keeping that conversation about the Uluru Statement happening. So again, it's about continuing to create the awareness, but really putting pressure back onto decision makers and policy makers that we need to take those next steps. So it's not just a commitment, yes, we will have a referendum. Well, let's put a time frame around that. We know in everyday business, unless we have kind of clear KPIs that we've got to hit, it just kind of, oh yeah, that's a nice thing to do. Yes, that's important. Oh yes, but. So
we'll get to that one day. Yeah.
Exactly. So, we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. We know that there is support out there in the majority of Australians. We know that until this becomes real for Australians, like an election, a lot of people aren't going to turn their mind to it, but we know that general support's there. So putting a time frame to this, putting resources behind it, and being really clear and declarative about why this is good for us as a nation, why this actually helps us deal with and manage what comes next when we think about who we want to be as modern Australians.
So can you be a bit more specific about exactly what you would be putting to the Australian people in a referendum? What would you be asking for?
So I think, again, the work that's been done around what does a national framework for a voice look like? And I think it's as simple as that in terms of what we want to embed in our constitution. So the document that sets up all of our national kind of infrastructure, if you like, our high courts, our systems of governance. So we just want to put something in there that says First Nations people are important, and here there needs to be a structure for government, federal government, to deal with, talk to and engage with First Nations people.
And you would be asking the Australian people to vote, yes, I think that we should be developing that, or, and hopefully not many would vote this, no, I don't. That sounds clear and simple. We've had a number of referendums in the past. Well, the one for equal marriage rights was a plebiscite, not a referendum.
Correct.
But, you know, in the end, it acted pretty much like a referendum in terms of changing things. So this is not a new experience for Australians to be asked their opinion. So what's the resistance, do you think? Why is no major party anyway, going to the polls at the moment saying this is what they're going to do?
I think fear is a driver of a lot of things. It certainly becomes the barrier for progress in any way. Nobody likes change. We've got a new computer system. I hate it, but I'll get there eventually. I'll figure out where to find things. So fear is such a big driver. And sometimes that's fear of unknown. Often that's fear of unknown. I'm going to be generous in terms of where people fear that they think they're going to lose something out of this. And again, it's sort of, this is my point around, this is actually something that will benefit all of us. And in fact, there is no loss in this, and it's not a zero-sum game. And we can actually, when we think about being mature and thinking about what comes next, this gives us the tools of how we move forward.
It's interesting you talk about people feeling like they're going to lose, have to give something up. Because before we actually started the webinar, you and I were talking about votes for women and how that, you know, was fought very hard, both for and against. It finally was passed slowly in some places, more rapidly in others, and it just became part of the furniture almost as soon as it, and everybody would now think, why do we make such a fuss about that? And that, I think, was about people fearing loss of power and control. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's the same thing here. People are worrying, oh, I might not have the same power and control if I share with others. Yet, if you look at all the times we've done it, no, it turned out okay.
Well, not only does it turn out okay, but it opens up this bigger, broader, richer engagement. You have, you know, a greater diversity of opinions and greater thinking about this. So, you know, it's the more brains thinking about problem solving and more brains thinking about, have we thought of looking at it like this? That gives us different options. And, you know, I think as the 21st century, we've got to think differently if we're going to be competitive within a global economy, if we're going to tackle kind of issues around climate change and really things that are happening in our lifetime. We have to start doing things differently, and we have to be looking through a broader lens or lenses to think about what some of those solutions could be.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because as soon as you mentioned climate change and how we were grappling with it, it reminded me of the fact that when the bushfires were happening, there was suddenly a great deal of interest in the way Indigenous Australians had managed using fire and cool burns to get rid of, the build-up of fuel in the bush and things like that. So when our back's against the wall, we'll ask you for your opinion.
Absolutely. But again, you know, sometimes it's really important that you got to look back to look forward. So what have we lost in the intervening kind of momentum? You know, I'm a big foodie. I love my food, but I love the slow food movement. I love this idea, particularly as winter's kicking in, those slow braisers and, you know, slow braised kangaroo tail. There is nothing like it. It's better than ossobuco.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. I'll have to try it. I have eaten some kangaroo and enjoyed it, but kangaroo tail would be a new one for me. I must absolutely do it. I wanted to ask you, in the different stages of reconciliation, as you say, this is a journey, not a destination, but where does treaty come? How does treaty fit into that?
So a treaty, I mean, essentially it's an agreement between parties that about, well, how are we going to move forward? So it is part and parcel of the process. I'm not sure that it's a particularly linear process per se. I think there are ways and means of doing all of these, but I definitely, again, if we look to what's happening in Victoria and the kind of process that they're thinking about, so they've been very clear about wanting the goal of treaty as their kind of outcome, but now they're thinking about, well, how do we get there? What does the journey look like? What's the tools? What are the things we need to put in place so that once we get to making a treaty, we're really clear about what we want, why we want it, why we need it, and actually what's the treaty outcomes going to address as we go forward. So that's where the truth-telling stuff comes into it. That's where actually making sure that we've got the structures in place for people to be able to negotiate at both parties. It's about setting all those terms of how are we going to approach this, who gets to arbitrate that, what's in, what's out. Like, you know, it's all of these things that it's building the pathway to all of that. So treaty is a really important thing, and it's an ongoing conversation, but it's not a simple, okay, here's a piece of paper, let's sign off we go. It's an ongoing conversation.
So you're really talking about let's heal this relationship, and these are the processes that we can use to move us forward in a more respectful, equal and healthy way to go into the future, so that we're all made stronger as a result. I mean, absolutely. It's a no-brainer to me. Let's go out and do it. Come on.
We need more people like you, Jane.
Yeah. What are we wasting our time for? Worrying about, you know, that group of old white blokes that have always been the ones who go, oh, no, let's not do that. Let's move on and do it. I think this election, interestingly enough, is actually rather about that. It's about a whole lot of groups that are sick and tired of waiting for promises to be kept, for attention to be paid, for healing to be able to happen. But I'm aware that we've probably got questions in our audience, and this is about the time when we usually turn to them. So, Hannah, do we have any questions?
We have just the one question so far. So everyone watching along at home, don't forget that if you have a question for Karen this evening, please do share them in the Q&A section or in the chat. If you're watching along on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, don't worry, I have lots of screens here, and I'm making sure that I catch your question if you want to ask a question there as well.
It's okay. I've got more questions after this one, so I'm just being really generous to the audience.
Fantastic.
In the spirit of what Karen's saying.
It's a good idea to get the reminder in there that, yes, those of you watching along at home, this is the time to pop your questions in. One from Carolyn, who you sort of talked about this a little bit, about the importance of the wording and what exactly you would be asking for in a referendum. How important is it to get that wording right? And can you foresee any difficulties in sort of getting the wording right, or it sort of being worded in bad faith, depending on who forms the next government?
It's a really good question. I think getting any kind of wording or statement or question right is always going to be a challenge. Sometimes getting the right message in a birthday card is a challenge. But there's going to be a whole bunch of people much smarter than me, and lawyers and people who are constitutionally kind of focused on this that are working on that as we speak. And no doubt we'll be kind of running it past and testing it with a whole range of people. But I think the really important part for us, and certainly us as voters, is to make sure the intent of that question is really clear. So understanding the meaning that's behind it and the intention of what a vote for yes would actually mean.
Well, I would recommend that whoever wrote the Statement of the Heart is brought into that planning committee, because, as I say, it was beautifully done. I've got a question about the Indu card, or the cashless debit card, which is something I have a particular antipathy about, because I think it's stigmatising. It's also the privatisation of welfare, which really worries me. And I think it is a form of government-backed coercive control. But I'm interested in your take on it, because I know that, it has felt like there's a racist element to the cashless debit card. But I'd love your opinion on it.
Look, I don't disagree with anything you said. I think anything that becomes compulsory, anything that takes away people's agency and decision making. I mean, looking at First Nations people, the last 200 years of being told what you can do, where you can live, who you can marry, has had devastating effects on our people and how we're able to just function as communities and as families. So anything that's compulsory doesn't work for me. I think when it was particularly introduced and only focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, again, there's an element to that says this is above and beyond any good intent that could come out of this. I mean, that being said, I think we need to be providing tools for communities and individuals and families about how do you help them manage, whether it's family budgets, whether it's managing money, how do you help them within welfare? But I think it was kind of overreach and certainly a lot heavy-handed.
Yeah. And I think it has now become almost a cause célèbre in terms of lots of people banding together. And I've certainly, and as you were talking about it, I thought, my God, we have been actually practicing a kind of statewide coercive control on First Nations people. I mean, I'm just thinking about all this stuff because I just wrote a book about coercive control, so it's high in my brain. And I also think that a lot of Australians have a lot of non-Indigenous Australians have a lot of goodwill, but they don't know where to start, and they also often feel a bit tentative. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. What would you say to people who feel a bit like that?
So I would pick up on our theme for National Reconciliation Week behind me there, be brave.
Right.
Because I think it is about kind of addressing those fears. So be really clear about the intention. What is the fear of stopping you? And when you fear that you're going to get it wrong, what is it you think you're going to get wrong? What is it you actually want to know? There's a thing called Google. It's really great. And it can show you all sorts of things that you can learn about without actually having to even talk to an Aboriginal person as a first instance. So, arm yourself up, teach yourself, do your homework, get a feel for something. And then again, you mentioned comedy. I mean, there is some amazing Aboriginal comedy on Netflix and Stan and all of those streaming platforms to get a sense of culture. There are so many events that happen, and we've got National Reconciliation Week coming up. We've got NAIDOC Week coming up. Again, lots of community events if people want to immerse themselves in culture. We've got amazing performing companies like Bangarra and theatre companies right across the country. Again, giving you that taste of who we are. Mm-hmm. And then, take those steps, take those learnings and start testing it out. So have those conversations with your family and your friends. Have the conversation about the Uluru Statement. Read the Uluru Statement. Think about what does that mean. Start that conversation. Bring more people on board. Of course, reconciliation action plans are kind of one of the programs that we run. So if you run a business, if you work in an organisation, find out whether you have a RAP plan. And if you do, get involved that way. If you don't, start talking to your people about what might that entail. And we've got a team of people ready, willing to help and support as that journey grows. It's really about just overcoming that fear, being brave, being courageous and taking a step. And maybe you will get it wrong, but what's the worst that can happen? You can be a little bit embarrassed. We've all been there, but if this is something that we truly believe in, then take the next step, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, have another crack.
Yeah. And I do think I've always felt that if you mentioned intent, that if people's intent is good, if it comes from a good place, then a clumsiness of expression or do it can be forgiven because, okay, that person's trying, they're being brave. If that's the intent, then who's going to mind? I always remember I went to the, it used to be called the Crocker Stedford. Does it still happen?
No, I don't know actually, but no, I used to be in the Crocker Stedfords.
Oh, well, I probably watched you. I remember watching Leah Purcell being the MC, and it was absolutely amazing. Some of those Aboriginal kids were just extraordinary with what they could do. The dancing was just mind blowing. And they used to put a careers thing on at the same time, and I'd gone through the careers. They were showing all these kids, what the police were there offering police careers, and nursing was there. It was quite interesting. But at the end of it, I thought, I wonder if this is getting through. And there was a group of young First Nations women standing there, and I looked at them and I thought, I'm old, I'm white, I don't know anything. Should I go up? But I wanted to know, is this I'm impressed, but who cares if I'm impressed? It's not for me. So I went up to them and said, I see that you've gone through it. Did you like it? And they just looked at me and they went, it was all right. And I said, oh, why did you do it? And they said, oh, you got a free CD at some of the stalls. So we went in for the free CDs, and I thought, they're just like my daughters, teenagers, exactly the same. and yes, it had some effect, but not nearly as big an effect, perhaps, as the Crocker Stedford had on me. But that, I was ashamed to say that took a little bit of courage. Mind you, walking up to any group of teenagers takes courage. But they were just fantastic. We had a chat. It was great fun.
Yeah, I'm sure if we were able to track kids, the hundreds of kids that went through those moments. Like I said, I was one of those kids that participated, and this is where I am today. So who knows how that stuff kind of connects and inspires and, just creates that knowledge that there is another world out there and there are other kind of ways to go. And you mentioned Leah Purcell, and of course she's got the amazing The Drover's Wife film, which has just recently premiered. And I have seen it and I highly recommend it. It's such a great retelling of an Australian classic.
I saw the play. I'm dying to see the film, but I have seen the play and I thought it was extraordinary. And it's taken that story to a new place with a new depth and a new lens. It's actually doing exactly what you're talking about in terms of the voice to Parliament. It's actually taking a First Nations lens to a colonial story.
Absolutely.
And that's the power of it, that it's sort of, it's a wonderful piece of work. She's an extraordinary.
Amazing.
The talent is absolutely wonderful. Do we have any more questions, Hannah, from our audience?
Yes, we have a question here, or two questions actually, from Carla on Instagram. Carla wants to know, are there any Indigenous Australians that are opposed to or not satisfied with the Uluru Statement? And why is that? And how can we ensure that reconciliation can meet the needs of all people?
I would like to be able to be 100% satisfied with, to satisfy everybody 100%. I'm a realist that knows that that's not always the case. So there may well be Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people out there who don't agree, but the overwhelming majority of people, the people that have participated in the dialogues, in the lead up to this, and certainly in some of our reconciliation barometer polling, says overwhelming majority, 80-something%, believe in the Uluru Statement and see it as a way forward. There's all sorts of reasons why, again, from an Indigenous perspective, that may not be the case. There's a suspicion that actually it's going to go nowhere, that it's a bunch of politicians talking again. And I think there's, again, our history has been that reminded of Charlie Brown and Lucy from the Peanut strips, of lots of hope being raised and then for it to be taken away at those last minutes. So there are great cynics amongst all of us in that process. But again, as I said, the majority of people, Aboriginal people, absolutely support this and see this as a way forward. And I think more people, once they actually start seeing it working, seeing it come to fruition, you're likely to see more people come on board.
But, every time anyone suggests anything, there are always those who don't agree with it. That's just normal.
Oh, absolutely. And as we said before, change, everybody fears change in some way, shape or form. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are no different in that process either.
And do you think that's why it's so important that this is something we need a referendum for, to have constitutional change so that it can't be undone, so that it is set in stone, so that trust isn't betrayed again?
Absolutely. I mean, again, whether you like it or not, whether it's a boring document or not, it is that foundational document, and it is a hard thing to change. So we saw in 67, with that overwhelming majority of Australians who voted yes, it kind of created a foundation and built into that to change, so that Aboriginal people were considered it to be counted in the census, and then also because it allowed the federal government to make laws when it came to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So yeah, enshrining this idea into a founding document and through a referendum, it takes the day-to-day politics out of it. It puts it above, like the High Court. It's not about who's in power and who gets a say. It's actually, this is about the benefit of all of us.
Yeah. And I think you're right about it giving it a sense of gravitas and importance, which, matters, makes a huge difference.
It does.
Yeah. Hannah, more questions from the floor or not yet?
We don't have anyone else coming in on Instagram. I can see we have multiple people watching though, so please do ask your questions at home if you're watching along. I guess I have another sort of question around the importance of doing this through a referendum. Can you talk a little bit to the importance of this being something that all of Australia needs to make a decision on, rather than just leaving it in the hands of a select few politicians?
Look, again, I think something of this level and this gravitas, I think it's important that all Australians get to have a say. I think it's important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to see that wide support of the broader community. And again, it's about how do we move forward. So it is about us sort of putting our hand up and saying, yeah, we want this to be different. We want the relationship between First Nations people and us to be different. And we're kind of we're supporting and we're backing this idea of this is how it can work. And I think that's the thing that I see and hear most often, is that this makes sense to the majority of Australians as a way forward. It makes, even in its worst moments, I hear the kind of, oh, can't we just be over the Indigenous issue or the Aboriginal issue? And it's like, well, yeah, I'd like to be over it too, but this is a way, and you have to play a role as that within that as well. So I think, and again, people that kind of say, oh, maybe we should wait until we know for certain that we'll get 100% or that we'll get a high percentage. Again, I think that's fear stopping us from pushing ahead. If, and I'm not saying it will, but if we weren't to make it, well, then that's a statement too. And that tells us we've got more work to do. I'd like to think, and I'm very confident that we would get it over the line, but I think we've been talking about it for long enough now. We need to kind of, as they say, on the pot or off the pot.
Yeah. So there's a fear amongst some members of the community that what if it doesn't pass? Where does that leave us? Yeah. And given that we've had two prime ministers basically say no, they're not going to do it, Malcolm Turnbull first and now this current prime minister, I can't even say his name. Oh dear. Anyway, that is disheartening. So it's been put on into the too hard basket anyway. So that means you have to keep fighting to get it out of there.
Well, yes. And I guess the point is, this fear of, well, what if people say no? Well, that doesn't change people's attitudes. If their attitude is no, it still means we have a lot of work to do. We're just really a bit more clear and transparent about what that work is going forward. So, again, it's been a long time coming. We need to kind of be able to move forward or regroup differently.
So you're actually not, okay, it would be painful if there was a no vote. I would find it very painful, I have to say, but I can't imagine what it would be like for First Nations Australians. But nevertheless, in that case, it informs you. So you're about facing the facts. There's no use protecting yourself from the truth. I suppose we're going back to what we were talking about before about truth telling. White Australians have been trying to protect themselves from the truth of the horrible things that happened in our past. And it's understandable that people would want to protect themselves from the truth of some of those attitudes not having gone away yet.
Absolutely. But the reality is if people are voting no, then they haven't gone away. So let's not pretend that the things that we're doing over here makes it all okay. Let's face up to that. Let's be honest about it. And then let's figure out, well, what do we need to do next? What do we need to change? How can I change people's minds? Or what is it that they are fearing? And how do we address that?
And one would have to suspect that when prime ministers say, no, I don't want to do it, their fear is not that it would fail. Their fear is that it would succeed. And that surely is quite a hopeful sign. Perverse kind of.
I would never presume to know what goes through the mind of a prime minister and what their motivations might be. But certainly, I think as leaders, there is an onus on prime ministers to lead and to face into things, particularly when it are things that might be difficult, things that might be uncomfortable. But again, that's what a leader does, and not only face into it, but bringing your people with you. It's something that as a CEO, I have to do every day as we navigate whatever it is, COVID or whatnot. And again, I'd like to think that a prime minister, a minister, a government would kind of lean into these things.
Wouldn't we all? But I will say this, you are demonstrating exactly that by the way you are talking here tonight, and by the way you are saying if the result will be painful, then let's feel the pain and work through that and then deal with it and find a way to move on to the point where we actually succeed. That seems to me to be exemplary leadership, in fact. Well, if there's no more questions from the floor, I think we may have reached the end of our session. What do you reckon, Hannah?
I think we're all dried up. Yeah. There's no final questions.
I've been dried up for years.
Oh, I'm on that road too.
It's a wonderful thing. I can recommend it. The sunny uplands of post-menopause. Fantastic. Best time ever. So, yeah, I want to say, Karen, is thank you for your leadership, which you have demonstrated so beautifully tonight. And also for your warmth and your good humour. It never fails to impress me that, people who have been dealing with the kinds of degrees of problems, abuse, racism, prejudice, bias, etc., who just manage to understand that is not how to become yourself. You rise above it in a way. And I'm so impressed. And as I said, I think the Uluru Statement of the Heart is an extraordinary document. It's something that's lacking in Australian history, that sense of inspiration and the importance of history. Federation, as you say, is an important document, but it's a very bureaucratic, process-driven. It's not got the heart in it.
True, but the speeches that led up to that were legendary. The Henry Parks of the world and the orations that they did, the soapboxes, that stuff was, so that idea that we don't have that in our history, in our colonial recent history, 100 years mightn't be that recent, but I think it's there. We're not tapping into it for whatever reason. And I think it's what I'd like to think is there are new and different voices that perhaps don't look like a Henry Parks, but can be just as inspiring and can be just as, rousing to the troops.
Well, we need to hear more of their speeches. I think I've been exposed to a couple of them, and you're right, but I'm not as aware of that kind of history as I should be. And like you, I'm a bit of a history nerd. So obviously it is on me to go and read some of those speeches. Henry Parks, of course, inspirational, started public education in New South Wales. And that is a hell of a claim to fame, I have to say. Well, thank you, Karen. And thank you for joining us tonight. It's fantastic. And thank you for the work you do. And I'm sure you absolutely embody the message that you have on your sign behind you, that of being brave and making change. So thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure having a yarn with you tonight. And I wish both you and Hannah the best of luck.
Thank you very much. we wish it back to you in getting an Indigenous voice to our Parliament. I reckon we'll see it in the next, maybe not next term, but in the next few years.
Well, with allies like you, I'm sure we can.
Well, I've got to get the Senate first. All right, lovely. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Hannah to finish up.
Okie doke. Thank you so much as well to you, Jane, for hosting again this evening. And thank you once more to you, Karen. Thank you for sharing your voice as a part of this momentously important movement. I hope that the world gets to hear more oration from Karen Mundine in the future.
Me too. Me too. They will, I suspect. They will.
And thank you as well to everyone at home. Thank you to everyone on social media who was following along and asking questions. This video will be available up on YouTube straight away. So if you would like to share it with your family and friends and start a conversation, then you can do that starting right from tonight. Thank you once again to Karen and Jane and everyone at home. And we'll see you next time.
And thank you, Hannah. Masterfully done as always. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.